The first night, wind combed the plains and stacked cold against the clapboard chapel, and Senna Bly learned how long an hour could be when you were awake for all of it. She pressed her back to the cedar door, knees tucked into her faded skirt, and watched the moon wheel across a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Her hands were cracked from travel and from the small habit she'd picked up somewhere along the last 2 weeks, rubbing the knuckles of her right hand with the thumb of her left until the skin went raw, as if she could erase thought by sanding it down to bone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The church's bell rope dangled inside, separated from her by a width of stubborn oak and a lock she hadn't tried. She wasn't here to ring it. She was here to be near it. The idea of sanctuary, even if all she had of it was a shadow on a step. Wagon ruts stitched the main street from the rail spur to the livery, and in the stretch between, Hollow Bend held its breath like towns do when winter is almost gone, but grief isn't. Senna had learned the names of towns by their silences. This one had the hush of people who were rationing more than flour. She hadn't eaten since noon, a heel of bread that tasted of pocket lint and the last crumbs of a stubborn pride. Her boots were a mismatched pair she'd traded for in Sage Bluff, one with a broken lace and one with a split sole that drank snowmelt every time she moved. She kept still. If she didn't move, she didn't get colder. If she didn't get colder, maybe she wouldn't have to decide between knocking and being turned away or walking on and losing the step that, tonight at least, felt like a threshold where even God would be gentle. A lantern angled into view at the far end of the street. It bobbed with the rhythm of a man who'd been in the saddle since dawn. Steady, a little loose at the knees, the kind of loose born of endurance. Senna shrank deeper into the dark where the chapel eaves met the bell tower. Lantern light glowed along the dome of the livery cat, then wheeled past, then slowed, unsure. The horse blew steam. Spur chains stopped their quiet clink. "Evening," the rider said, to the night, not to her. His voice was low and smooth, trained by long distances and few words. "Reverend's gone up valley. Won't be back till Sunday." Silence answered. Senna made herself the same shape as it. Door swells when it snows. The lantern tipped, showing the church handle. Looks closed when it ain't. She stayed still and counted 4 breaths after the last word, because she knew about men who were kind with 1 sentence and different with 2. She breathed a 5th time and told herself he was only a voice and a light and the clean smell of a horse. Then the light turned away. Hooves clopped the length of the street, faded toward the river. When the last echo died, the night grew larger than she was ready for, and Senna discovered there are kinds of fear that arrive only after you've safely survived the first kind. She slept in slivers, waking whenever the wind shouldered the bell tower, waking whenever her stomach did something hollow and mean, waking whenever a wagon creaked by and someone's laughter lifted from a saloon with a name she couldn't see but could guess. Twice she thought she heard footsteps. Once she did. A boy with a newspaper sack came at dawn, tried the church door, and finding it stuck, shrugged and left his bundle on the stoop beside her knee.
"Sorry," he said, noticing her only when he straightened. His sorry wasn't for her, it was for the surprise of her. She gave him a tilt of chin that meant nothing and everything, and pulled the papers close for their small, papery heat after he trotted off. The masthead read, "Hollow Bend Messenger," in type that wanted to be bigger if ink had been cheaper. Below it, "River ice thins, ranchers warned. Sheriff requests witnesses from mill fire." She did not read further. Words were expensive when you kept them. By mid-morning, she'd tested the church door and found the lantern man had been right. It opened grudgingly, swollen and thirsty, and the interior smelled of beeswax and pine. She stepped inside, closed the door, stood for a long moment among the pews like a woman who had forgotten whether she was the one leaving or the one being left. A hymn book sat open on the lectern, a sprig of dried rosemary sleeping flat between two pages, someone's memory of someone who had needed help. She touched the sprig and backed away, as if the book might wake and ask what she had to offer in return. Tired makes you foolish. She almost curled up in the last pew, but the hour was thin, and the town would notice a stranger asleep in a sanctuary. She took the broom, leaned by the door, and swept the step because sweeping gave her a reason to be on it. The act turned her into someone useful, and useful people repelled some kinds of trouble. She did not know the rider's name when he appeared again with the noon sun, but she knew the horse now, liver chestnut with a blaze over one eye and a temperament that eyed the world with quiet suspicion. He had no lantern this time, just a canteen and a canvas sack tied behind his saddle. He saw her and did nothing sudden about it. His not sudden was a kindness on its own. "Door let you in?" he asked. She nodded once. Her throat was a rope pulled tight under skin. "Reverend won't mind. He says the church belongs to God first and to tired folks second." He dismounted. "You look second." A dozen answers lined up and tripped over each other in her head. She tried none of them, set the broom aside, kept her hands where he could see them. He loosened the cinch one notch, let the horse blow and shake its mane, then eased the canvas sack off the saddle with a care that said the sack held bread. He set it on the step. "You can say no," he added. "Sometimes saying no is how a person keeps hold of their own name. But if you say yes, there's coffee and jerky that tastes like cedar fence posts and half a pie I should have shared yesterday and didn't." Pie was a word that made her eyes sting for reasons she didn't intend. She studied the dirt on his boots and the mend on his sleeve and the way he stood with his weight even over both feet, as if he had decided to be patient a long time ago and had not changed his mind since. "I don't owe you for it?" Her voice surprised her by existing. It sounded like oak rubbed with sand, smoother halfway through. "You don't owe me for it." He waited a breath. "You don't owe me anything." She let the broom be a long second more, then knelt at the sack's side. A tin cup clinked. The steam rising from the thermos was the first holy thing she'd seen in days. He didn't look at her while she poured. He talked to the horse instead. Low and casual, the way a man does when he intends to make a woman feel alone enough to breathe, and not so alone she's an invitation. "Name's Rowan," he told the horse, which she suspected was a lie about his own name and not the horse's. "We'll check the north fence after town. If the rivers come up any, that low crossing is going to be a wallow again." She tasted coffee and let the heat move through her chest like fresh courage. She didn't look at him when she said, "Senna." If a man meant harm, you didn't give him your true name. But the thing about a name is that sometimes keeping it is telling it. "Senna," he repeated, as if he'd found it written on a fence post and liked the hand that had carved it there. He poured himself a swallow, then tightened his canteen and lifted the sack. "There's Stewart Sable's boarding house nights, if you can trade Dawn chores for it. She's strict about debts in the way decent people are." Senna set the cup down and squared her shoulders. "I've work in me. Mend, cook, patch, write a clean hand, figures in my head, She stopped. Saying too much has weight. He nodded like a man who had already decided he believed her. "I know Sable," he said. "I'll tell her you're respectable." He tipped the glance sideways. "Not that you need telling." Hot rose to her face. It wasn't the kind that made you want to cry. It was the kind that felt like a dawn that belonged to you.
He gathered the reins, put a palm to the saddle, then paused. "I'll be back by dusk. If anyone bothers you, go inside and drop the bar. There's a bolt on the sacristy door that sticks, but it holds if you lift when you slide." Why would anyone bother me? The question was honest, not naive. A measure of danger. Not of the world, but of this street. Because some men take a woman's hunger as an invitation they wrote themselves. He said it without heat, which made it sink deeper. Because you're new. Because there was a fire at the mill a week ago, and men who don't know where to put their fear will spend it wherever there's room. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Dusk. She watched him go and told herself she would not wait for his return. She had learned to live without many things. She could live without dusk being a person who came back when he said he would. She lasted till noon and 1 and 2, and in the small hours that get lost between 3 and 4, a woman with a flour-dusted apron brought her a saucer of stew and the measure of a look that tested whether Senna would say thank you or sorry or please. Senna said, "I can wash your pots." The woman's chin lifted 1 notch at the competence of it. "Name's Sable. You'll pay me for that stew in the morning. 6 minutes of work for every spoonful you took. You'll eat at my table if I say you can, and you'll sleep under my roof if you show me you can tell the truth even when it costs you." "I can tell the truth," Senna said, "and I can pay. You'll pay with work before you pay with anything else. Spoons in the wash basin by 8. Church steps no bed." Sable's chin tipped toward the chapel door as if it had been Senna's idea to move indoors, and Sable was magnanimously endorsing it. Senna held her gaze, nodded, and tried the shape of the boarding-house keeper's name against the back of her teeth. Some names carried heat. Sable's carried a long, cool river. Dusk drew a line down the street. Men's hands found their way to the bottoms of their jackets where pistols slept. Women's hands found the mouths of kids who didn't yet know the price of shouting. Senna took the papers into the church, read the first paragraph about the mill fire, learned there had been 2 men caught in the lower level when the river ran back through the sluice, and a 3rd who went in after them, and none came out until morning. The sheriff asked for witnesses. The paper asked for prayers. Senna folded the news along an old crease and set it on the lectern beside the rosemary. Roan came back when the sky was the color of a bruise healing. His horse's left foreleg wore mud past the fetlock. He didn't. She took that as a detail that belonged to him. He set the sack on the step again like an answer to a question she hadn't asked. Thence held, the river came up a hand and stopped being reasonable. He tilted the sack toward her. "Sable sent you bread, and a look you'll have to return." "I'll return it," Senna said, and surprised them both by smiling. They ate on the step. He set 1 riser down, not beside her, so he would be below the line of the door if a stranger peered around the corner and saw silhouettes. They shared the light the way people do when they've already decided they won't spend it on a story of themselves. He didn't ask where she had come from. She didn't ask where he learned it was polite not to ask. "It's quiet here," she said, because she needed to say a true thing to make room for other truths. "Quiet's a shape," he answered. "Hollow Bend takes that shape when it's waiting." "For what?" "For spring, for a baby that's due at the Wilsons' place, for the sheriff to catch the mill fire to the right man, for a letter that might not come. Folks are always waiting. I try to be one of the things they don't have to wait for." He said it like it was a small thing to be on time with your kindness. Senna chewed bread that was still warm from Sable's oven and let her stomach remember what enough felt like. "You were on the road long," he said, not framed as a question, and she rewarded the form with an answer. 2 weeks from Sage Bluff. Before that, 3 days from the river. Before that, a boy with a wagon who needed his harness mended and paid me with a mile of ride and an orange. I saved the rind till it turned soft in my pocket. He nodded, like he could feel the weight of the rind, like he could put his finger on where in her skirt she'd kept the pocket, and where in the pocket she'd kept the corner of that orange as sun. "Why'd you stop here?" She looked at the chapel door. "Because it didn't look at me," then added, because it was the truest thing she could say without telling the one that would cost her too much in the telling, "and because the road ends at the river, and I don't want to cross yet." He drank that answer down and didn't ask for the thicker part of it. Some men are thirsty in a way that makes you smaller when you pour. He wasn't. He rose at last, shook out his shoulders, slid the sack toward her with one boot. "Sable expects you at 7, he said. "She'll pretend she doesn't." He touched the brim of his hat again, which she now knew was a habit and not an affectation, and left her with the kind of dusk that makes a second night less cruel, because the dark now contains a voice you trust. The second night, Senna learned that sleep comes quicker when a town knows your name. Not everyone knew it. Names are currency, and not everyone spends. But Sable said it twice on purpose in the boarding-house kitchen when Senna showed up at dawn with her sleeves rolled. "Senna, that kettle goes on first. Senna, that knife's dull. Take the stone to it before you slice." She didn't smile. Sable distributed gravity. By noon, Senna had traded 6 minutes for spoonfuls and then some. She'd washed spoons till her hands pruned, sanded a splinter out of a chair rung, mended a hem that had been dragging on the floor so long it had learned to be a broom. In return, she received stew without counting and a place near the stove to warm her palms. Once, when the front door swung open and 2 ranch hands thundered in with the weather, Sable stepped into their path with a spoon like a Marshall star. "You'll wipe your feet or you'll track the valley into my parlor, and I won't have it," she said, and they stopped as if they'd hit a fence. Senna watched, memorized the angle of Sable's jaw and the way power moved across a room without anyone having to raise their voice. She stored the knowledge where she stored the other skills that had kept her alive. Where to sit in a room if you need a back wall and a line of sight to the door. How to make questions smaller by answering a truer one beside them. How to keep a spoon from clattering so a night shift man can sleep in the room above the kitchen. Roan came again at noon and again at dusk, not always with a sack and not always with words. Once he brought a length of rawhide, set it on the step, and said, "For your boot, so your foot doesn't remember cold as a language." She stripped the old lace, threaded the new, and felt something inside her rethread too. By the end of the second day, the town had fit itself around her in the small ways that matter. Children learned to run to the edge of the chapel step and then go no farther. The sheriff's deputy, Mrs. Ortega, with a silver badge and a braid as firm as wire, touched her brim to Senna when she walked her rounds. The livery cat decided Senna's lap was a nation it could recognize. And Senna slept, not the slivered kind, but the honest kind that arrives when you can tell yourself in the last minute before you go under, "I am not chased, I am not watched, I am not in debt to anyone I can't repay with the work of my hands." It should have stayed that way. A single step isn't much to ask from the world, but the world makes its business out of what should have been. On the third morning, the river changed its mind. It broke up like a glass you didn't realize you dropped till it's already in pieces. Cakes of ice spun like coins thrown into a barroom for a bet, and the road to the far shore became nothing unless your horse had wings. The bridge was nothing too. It had been logs laid on prayer. The sawmill stood sullen and wet, with boards stacked like a graveyard, and the smell of ash still hiding in the damp. By noon, men were knotted on the mill road, and the sheriff stood at the front with a clipboard and a calm face you put on because calm is a tool. If you saw smoke before midnight, you'll write your name here. If you saw a man near the sluice, you'll tell me whether he limped. If you saw a boy, you'll tell me what color his hat was. Senna kept to the edge of the knot. She had a rag in her hands and a reason to be on the chapel step, but her breath learned a new rhythm, and it wasn't quiet. Her eyes kept going to the mill's lower windows that stared like shut mouths. She fixed the rag on the corner of the stair post and rubbed the grain of the wood until it shone. A man left the knot and drifted to the livery like a cloud that had decided it didn't belong with other clouds. He wore a city coat whose shoulders had remembered better fabric.
He wore a watch he checked too often, and a hat with a dent that said a woman had removed it, and not a man. He saw Senna and took off his hat to her in a way that announced everything he thought he had to offer.
"Ma'am," he said, and his smile came up through his mouth, but not his eyes. She inclined her head as if she did not notice the misfit. "Sir?" "Name's Calder Rook." He smiled wider, as if the breadth of it would sell it. "I represent the mill, which is to say I represent laws, which is to say I am generous. I sweep the step," she said, "because saying a small thing sometimes keeps a larger one from entering the room." He looked past her at the church door, then past that to the bell rope inside. "I've worn the expression you're wearing," he said. "I could pay to remove it. I have rooms. I have coin. I have—" Senna glanced beyond him and found Rowan across the street, standing beside his chestnut with the reins loose and the horse's head down, the picture of a man who had made a promise to a room and was waiting for the room to figure itself out. Rowan's jaw ticked once when he saw Calder Rook tip his hat again. He did not move. "Thank you," Senna said to Calder, and returned to the stair post and its grain. The rag had a small tear. She twisted it and made the tear part of its strength. Calder let silence grow like a vine and then tried to climb it. "You've slept here 3 nights. You are either stubborn or stubborn. Both are expensive." "Some debts I can carry," she murmured. "Not the kind I mean. A woman alone is a woman," Sable said from the boarding-house doorway. She did not raise her voice, but the syllables reached anyhow. "And a man selling himself would do better 2 buildings down, where the cards are dealt." Calder laughed as if he had meant to be scolded. "I'll come back," he said to Senna, with a proprietary dip of his hat brim that pretended it was a favor. "When you are done pretending the air is a blanket." He turned. Rowan stepped off the boardwalk and arrived at the chapel step at the same time as Calder's shadow. The expression on Rowan's face wasn't anger. It was the expression men wear when the weather turns dishonest. "Mornin'," Rowan said, to the step, to the town, to Calder only incidentally. "Do you speak for her, or is she still in possession of her own voice?" "She has more voices than you have rooms," Rowan said mildly. Calder's gaze slid from Rowan's hat brim to his boots and paused there, as if dirt could be weighed like coin. "You from here?" "From now, which is where most men do their best work." Calder's smile thinned. "I'll call again," he told Senna, as if he were scheduling a train. "We'll talk when you're ready to be helped." He went. Rowan stayed. He didn't watch Calder go. He watched Senna's hands, which had resumed their habit of rubbing one knuckle with the other thumb. "Do you want me to put him off for good?" he asked. "You'll put him off because I can. You'll let him come back because I can." Rowan considered that, nodded once, and leaned a shoulder against the post. They stood that way a long time while the town tried to make order out of floodwater and ash. Once, Mrs. Ortega came by and asked Senna if she had seen any man near the mill that night who walked like he was learning to walk again. Senna shook her head no. The word left a bitter taste. By evening the cold came back as if it had remembered an appointment. Sable sent Senna with a loaf for the parsonage and a jar of oil for the chapel's hinges. Senna took both, oiled both, and told the door it could stop pretending to hate being useful. When she returned the jar, Sable said, "The 3rd night is where the shape of you shows." "What shape is that?" Senna asked. She looked at her as if measuring a dress. The shape that goes, or the shape that stays. Senna did not answer, not because she didn't know, but because knowing is a smaller thing than being able to say it out loud and keep breathing. When the dusk came, it came fast. Rowan sat his chestnut like a man listening to something at a distance that other people couldn't hear yet. The mill road quieted. The river spoke a little louder, tossing ice. Calder Rook did not return, but his shadow did. The shadow you carry when you've promised yourself you'll collect. Senna set her back to the chapel door and let the wood take some of her weight. She had slept on a church step for 3 nights and found that humility is a blanket if you tuck it right. Behind her, the bell rope creaked once, like a throat trying to sing after too much silence. In front of her, the street gathered what was left of its light. Rowan crossed that light. He didn't come to the top step. He stood one down again, hat brim low, eyes higher. He did not smell of whiskey. He smelled of horse and leather and air you get by riding until what hurt when you started is a story by the time you stop. Senna, and his name in his mouth felt like the first warm thing after a long winter.
She looked up. He was careful with the part of her that watched the door. He was careful with the part of her that had learned to count exits. He knew where the sheriff was tonight and how late Sable kept her light and the angle at which Mrs. Ortega wore her badge when she was deciding to forgive a boy or to teach him. He had learned a town the way a man learns a horse, by hands and listening. "You can say no," he said again, repeating the only contract she trusted. "You can say later. You can say first I need to wash, and then I need to sleep, and then I need a day in which my name belongs only to me." He swallowed. She heard it. Men like Rowan worked to make themselves quiet. The body betrayed them in small sounds. But if there's a word in you that isn't no, if there's a name for what you want that I can carry some of the weight of... He stopped. Sometimes a sentence is a bridge, and sometimes it's a cliff. Her hands had gone still on her skirt. She could feel where the fabric was threadbare at the knees from the places she'd chosen to kneel that no one had asked her to. She rolled her shoulders back and found out they were still hers. She looked past Rowan to the river. The ice turned in slow circles, like a thought you don't dare finish because finishing will require you to live differently after. "I don't want a favor," she said. "I don't have one to give. I have a door and a table and fence wire that keeps going slack. I have a mare who hates thunder and a stove that smokes when the wind's wrong. I have neighbors who mind their own business and then mind if I ask. I have a bed that hasn't forgotten how to be kind. I have..." He stopped again, softer. "I have room." In the law of the trail, room is another word for mercy. She thought of Calder Rook's watch that couldn't keep time with anything but itself. She thought of Sable's spoon like a star. She thought of Mrs. Ortega's braid and the way the livery cat had claimed her lap. She thought of a bridge that was logs on prayer and a river that had decided to be honest about its power. She thought of the 3 nights behind her that had been a kind of counting. Senna stood. The step felt higher than it had when she sat down. The door behind her gave a small sound, as if approving. She put her palm against the jamb and promised it she knew the difference between abandoning and leaving. She whispered to herself and to the wind that had been her only listener for too long, "Say the word that changes the map." Rowan's throat moved again. He reached, not for her hand, but for the space where a hand might be if she offered it, which was the most careful thing he'd done yet. "I'll walk," he said, "if you want. I ride too much. It would be good to learn a road at the speed of a person again." Mrs. Ortega's lantern clicked at the far end of the street. Sable's window threw a square of honey onto the dust. The river shouldered ice along its banks. The bell rope behind Senna swayed once and was still. She blinked, and the world sharpened, as if the act of deciding had rubbed it clean. Her fingers loosened on the jamberry, her feet found the riser below and the one below that. Rowan did not move toward her. He let her step into her own choice until she stood on the same stair as he did and could see his breath when he laughed once, softly, at nothing. The word arrived. It was in his mouth, not hers. It was an invitation shaped like home. "Let's..." he began, and the rest of the sentence moved toward her like a hand. A shout cut the street. Boots angled out of the mill road at a speed that made bystanders step back. Calder Rook, coattail sharp, stride sharper, came hard with 2 men behind him wearing expressions that weren't theirs yet. They were borrowed from fear and hadn't fit. "Sheriff," Calder called, "I have your witness, and I have your thief." This finger pointed past Senna's shoulder to the chapel door she had just left. She was seen near the sluice the night of the fire. She's been hiding on God's porch because she knows a jail doesn't have a bell. The street turned its face toward her as one face. Even the river seemed to stop and listen. Mrs. Ortega's lantern light landed on Senna's cheek and stayed there. Rowan didn't touch her. He didn't have to. He felt the shape of him at his side like a promise that hadn't decided yet whether it was courage or trouble. "Let's go home," he whispered, and the words were the softest thing he'd ever heard a man say. But the sheriff was already walking toward them, and Calder's smile was already sharpening into a blade, and the river sailed a cake of ice into the bridge and took the middle log clean away. Senna inhaled, a last breath that belonged only to her, and opened her mouth to answer. The church bell, all on its own, began to ring.
The church bell, all on its own, began to ring. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. It tolled like a spine waking up. 1, 2, 3, each strike running down the clapboard and into Senna's shoulder blades through the door she had leaned on for nights. The sound startled the river birds, startled the men on the mill road, startled the livery cat into a puff. It startled even Calder Rook, who flinched as though the bell had rung his name and found him wanting. Senna didn't run. Running gives a shape to the story you don't want to be true. She stood very still and watched breath frost at the corners of Mrs. Ortega's mouth. The sheriff lifted her lantern, and the light climbed Senna's cheek like a question. "You pulled that rope?" Mrs. Ortega asked. Senna shook her head once. Behind her, the door's bar settled in its brackets, like a spine deciding what it would bear. Rowan stayed at her side, one stare down, hat brim low, body quiet the way a good horse is quiet when a rattlesnake hums. "Bell doesn't ring on its own," Calder said. His city coat looked wrong in the wind, as if it had been cut to move through drawing rooms and not through air that smelled of river chill and sawdust. "And your witness," he jerked his chin toward a thin man at his shoulder, "saw her near the sluice before the fire." The thin man tried to shrink behind Calder without actually hiding. He wore a hat pulled so low it shaded his jaw more than his eyes. His hands were clean in the way that comes of not doing much that dirt approves of. When Mrs. Ortega angled the lantern toward him, he blinked and found nowhere to look that wasn't the truth. "What's your name?" the sheriff asked. The man swallowed. "Giles," he said. "Giles Wren." "Did you see this woman at the mill?" Mrs. Ortega's tone had no edges. It was a place where a person could set down a fact and have it stay a fact. Giles rubbed 2 fingers together like he was counting coins he wished he had. "Saw someone," he said. "Night of the break, down by the sluice." He flicked his gaze toward Calder and then away. "Could have been her." "Could have been," Mrs. Ortega repeated, mild as milk. The lantern flared in a gust and showed the shine of sweat at Giles' hairline. "What color was her skirt?" Giles's mouth opened and shut. "Dark," he said finally. "Maybe blue." Senna glanced at her own hem. Brown, burned at one corner where a cook stove had kissed it a week ago. She did not lift it to show the scorch. She kept her hands still and her eyes on the sheriff. "What time?" Mrs. Ortega asked. Late. Or early. I don't keep hours, Sheriff. I keep my wits. His smile was a nervous animal that had learned to wear human teeth. I was walking, thinking. By the mill, in flood season with the ice breaking. You must do your best thinking where the river's loud. Calder's jaw tightened. He saw her, he said, sharper now, and she slept on that step like a thief who wants a sanctuary to cry innocence in. I swept this step, Senna said, and heard her voice as if the bell had taught it how. It was steady and low and carried farther than she expected. And I watched a river you do well to respect. Calder turned his smile toward her. Ma'am, are you able to account for your whereabouts on the night of the fire? He said it like he was giving her a favor. Yes, Senna said. She could account for all the nights, the ones that had almost killed her and the ones that had convinced her to keep going. I was learning this town in the only way that doesn't cost anyone, by listening, and the only thing I saw near the mill was a dark with teeth. Mrs. Ortega's gaze moved from Senna to Calder and back. Let's see the sluice. Seems to me truth likes to be walked to.
Roan's breath went out the way a man lets a horse look at a river before he asks it to cross. He didn't speak for her. He put his palm to the post as she stepped down, offering nothing but steadiness if she wanted it. She wanted it. She didn't take it. They went together, the sheriff with her lantern, Calder with his hired men whose mouths had not yet learned the shape of conviction, Giles Wren with his hat brim low, Sable from the boarding house, because some women understand that justice is too important to leave to uniforms, 3 townsmen who had lost wages to the mill's closure, the livery cat because it had decided Senna was interesting, and Roan, who paced the edge of the group like a weather front. The river spoke in a language that was all urgency and no panic. It hustled cakes of ice under the sawmill's low platform and smacked them against the leaning pilings like a teacher tapping a desk. The sluice mouth gaped, a black square with a lip of freshet foam. The char on the lower wall was old by a week and fresh by the way ash still answered wind. Mrs. Ortega crouched and lifted her lantern to peer along the eddy where wood curls and bark bits collected. "You see any tracks the morning after?" she asked the men who had followed. They shook their heads, sheepish. Of course not. The river wrote its own story over hours. She dragged the light along the edge where the ground slumped toward the water. But the river doesn't clean everything. "Witness says he saw her here," Calder insisted. "We'll find the proof." "Witness says he saw someone," Mrs. Ortega corrected. She turned the lantern toward the mill's underbelly. "Giles Wren, you tell me what you saw." Giles licked his lips. The lantern made the motion look reptile. "A figure," he said, "about her height." "How tall is she?" He floundered, pointed at Senna. "About that tall." "How many boards did she cross between the tool shed and the sluice?" What did she carry?" "Like I said." "You didn't say," Mrs. Ortega said, still mild, "and I am asking you too." Giles stared at the river, then at his shoes. "Bucket. Could have been a bucket." "Could have been," Mrs. Ortega said again, softly. "And the bucket's color." Giles' patience snapped where a liar's patience snaps, at the intersection of detail and the need to provide it. "I'm not a painter. I'm a citizen trying to help." "Help who?" Roan asked, friendly as sunlight. "The sheriff, or the man paying you to remember what suits him?" Calder pivoted. "You accusing my man of perjury, rancher?" Roan didn't tip his hat. He didn't move at all.
I'm asking whether his memory works better when he's looking at a city coin." Giles flinched. Calder covered it with a laugh that showed teeth. "Sheriff, are you going to allow this?" "I'm going to allow the river to speak," Mrs. Ortega said. She handed the lantern to Sable and slid down the embankment with the competence of a woman who had grown up where mud was a fact and not a failure. She braced one boot against a root and reached into the eddy where wood curls and bark bits collected. She held something up. Water spun off it in a glittering ribbon. A glove.
The leather had been fine once, the kind you wear to church when you want to look like kindness and not like money. Now it was sodden, and the river had chewed it until the stitching let go. But the cuff had a stitched rose in red thread that had been more proud of itself a week ago. Sable sucked her breath in so sharply the sound cut. "That's Kitty Vale's," she said. "She does my accounts Sundays. She embroiders roses on everything that'll hold still, even the kettle cozy." "Where is Kitty?" Mrs. Ortega asked, the question a simple door. Sable's mouth thinned. "Sick," she said. "Not from stew, from silence." Calder stepped closer, too close to the river, as if to assert himself over it. "And what does a glove prove? That someone dropped it? Perhaps this woman, perhaps anyone else. You'll hang a charge on who wore it the night it came off," Mrs. Ortega said. She turned the glove palm up. A smear of dark blurred the heel where a person's lifeline would live if hands believed in fortune. "Blood," she said, not loud. "And the stitch is new. Kitty's been fixing that cuff this week. I saw it on her Sunday." "Maybe the lady pricked her finger," Calder said, but he stepped back from the river's lip. The current made a sound that wasn't a warning and wasn't not one. "Maybe," Sable agreed. "Or maybe a person who wasn't Kitty wore her glove to keep the river's teeth off their skin." She looked at Senna, then at the sluice, then at Giles. "Men who tell the truth don't say could've so often." Giles's hands went to his pockets and came back empty, like he'd been hoping to find courage there. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you a poor student of detail," Sable said. "This woman's skirt is brown, not blue. She walks with her right shoulder a finger higher than her left from carrying something heavy for too many years. The person you saw by the sluice stumbles left-kneed, and the hem you describe doesn't catch on anything because it's been taken up by a hand that cares about tripping." Silence held the river still for the length of a prayer. Roan smiled with his eyes. "I'd put you on any jury," he told Sable. "Don't," she said. "I have stew." Mrs. Ortega slid the glove into the pocket of her duster and turned to Senna. "You see anything else you didn't say?" Senna's heart beat hard against the bruise of her fear. She opened her mouth and closed it, because a truth can be a trap if you don't set it right. Then she let the bell's lesson steady her. "I saw a man 3 nights ago," she said, "at the far end of the boardwalk near the mill. He wore a coat that didn't fit the weather and a watch that wanted everyone to notice it. He checked it like it could change the hour if it worked hard enough. His hat had a dent that wasn't his doing." Calder's smile didn't move, but the men behind him shifted the way cattle shift when a wind sets its teeth in the grass. "I didn't go to the sheriff then because I'd been poor long enough to know how a poor woman's testimony buys less than a rich man's silence, but I will say the name now if the sheriff asks it." Mrs. Ortega didn't look at Calder. She looked at Senna. "Say it." Senna said, "Calder Rook," and the river answered by shouldering a sheet of ice against a piling like a gavel finding a block. The men behind Calder moved their weight to their heels, which is the stance of a hired hand who had remembered a previous engagement. Giles Wren looked as if he'd swallowed the river wrong. Calder's mouth shaped a laugh that didn't come. He brushed at his lapel as if a truth had landed on it and left lint. "You're making an enemy you can't afford," said Calder. "I can't afford a lie," Senna answered.
Mrs. Ortega straightened. "Mr. Rook, you're going to give me the name of your hired men and where you paid them to stand on the night of the fire. You're going to come down to the office and let me ask you questions you'll wish I didn't know. And if you run, I'll know where you go, because men who polish their watches stop in every town long enough for people to notice them." Calder's eyes cooled. "The mill will reopen," he said. "This town is a ledger, and I am in the black." He tipped his hat toward Senna as if he were tipping it to himself. "Enjoy your church step. It won't love you when it rains." He turned, and this time it was Roan who stepped into his path. Not close, not unlawful, just present. "You were seen," Roan said, voice easy, "by a ranch hand who learned to read a river by listening to it. You can cross water quick, or you can cross it right. You try the first, you drown men. You try the second, you get to the other side with your boots in your name." Calder did not answer. His hired men redistributed themselves to the far edges of the town's attention and discovered they had other places to be. Giles Wren stumbled on the bank, slid and caught himself on a rotten snag that left his palm stung and his dignity damp. They left. Mrs. Ortega watched until Calder turned the corner and became a rumor again. Then she exhaled. "I'll talk to Kitty, if she'll talk back." She looked at Senna. "You're not in my jail tonight." Senna didn't sag. Sagging is something you do when no one can see. She nodded, once, the way a person acknowledges a reprieve she intends to earn. "Church bell," Sable said dryly, peering up at the tower. "You going to give it back its privacy?" Senna frowned. "I didn't pull it. Wind pulled it, or the rope decided it was tired of silence." He searched the tower with his eyes and found nothing but sparrows. Or the truth wanted a louder throat. They walked back together, Sable already reciting a list of chores for Senna in the morning to anchor her to the town by labor, Mrs. Ortega palming the glove as if it were the fin of a fish that if you held it steady long enough would pull a whole body out of the dark. Roan close and not touching. Senna step for step with the person she was deciding to be. Night kept its promise. It got cold. Sable set another place at her table without ceremony. Roan checked his horse's feet and left with a promise shaped like a tilt of his hat. Senna slept, and when dawn made itself known by changing the color of breathing, she went to the boarding-house kitchen and met Sable's gravity with her own. By noon, Senna's hands smelled of lye and rosemary and iron skillet. By evening, the town had adjusted to the fact that she wasn't passing through. The next day held two surprises. The first arrived as a letter. Mrs. Ortega brought it herself, in a pocket under the badge. "She came down from Sage Bluff with the trader. She said you might be the Senna was meant for." She raised a brow. "She wasn't sure. He said your name was a moving target." Senna wiped her hands on her apron and took the envelope like it might be hot. It was addressed in a hand that had learned to shape its letters on a slate and then in ledger columns. Purposeful, wide-shouldered. No return, no seal but wax smudged by a thumb pressed almost too hard. Sable flicked her dishcloth toward the back door. "Read it where you can hear yourself." Senna stepped onto the stoop and broke the wax. The river sounded like it had set its elbow on the bank and intended to stay a while. The letter smelled faintly of smoke and the kind of soap that makes a man seem more expensive than he is. "Senna, you don't know me, and I don't know you as anything but a line in someone else's ledger. But a name is a door. I was told yours. I have a debt with the mill that can be paid with a mouth if the mouth will open. I'm not brave. I'm not even good, not like you want. But I know where the oil was stacked and why the sluice was jammed that night. I know the watch the man wore and the joke he told at his own expense while the first boards lit. Sheriff won't hear me because I've run from too many things, but I'll speak if someone stands there and tells me I'm not a fool for trying. If you want it, meet me where the river lets the willow grow low, East Bend, where the cattle go down to drink, tonight, after moonrise. If you don't come, I'll assume I was wrong about the bell. End. J. Senna read it twice, and the second time saw the part that wasn't written. The tremor under the letters, the way the ink thinned where the quill had lifted when the writer had had to reconsider whether to be brave. She folded the paper and slid it under the waistband of her skirt where a pocket would have been if a pocket had been sewn there. Sable's voice arrived at her shoulder. "You're thinking of going. Yes. You'll take someone." She looked toward the road. She expected to find Roan as one expects to find a fence post still where you left it. He wasn't there. The horse was. Its head turned when she stepped off the stoop, and it whickered as if to report on the absence. "Roan rode north," Mrs. Ortega said, appearing from nowhere in the way Law learns to do. "Fence down on Whitlow land. He'll be back before moon if Whitlow's bull minds manners." "Bulls," Sable muttered. "Men that won't be scooped." She studied Senna the way you study a bridge you're about to trust with a wagon. "If you go without a friend, you go with wisdom. If you go with fear, you go back and start over. If you go because a man asked you to, and not because your own name asked you to, you'll drown. My name asked me. It's tired of closing its mouth." Sable nodded. "Then take this." She pressed a lantern into Senna's hands. "Not as a beacon, as a boundary."
The second surprise came toward dusk, on 4 wheels and a cracked axle. A wagon hammered itself into town with a woman on the seat and a baby strapped to her chest, and a boy of 6 holding to the sideboard like a sailor to a mast. The woman's face was the kind of tired that makes your teeth ache to look at it. She pulled up in front of the church and saw Senna on the stoop. Their eyes connected, the way 2 women's eyes connect when the world has been doing arithmetic on both of them. "I was told there's stew," the woman said, "and the sheriff is honest, and the river is mean when it doesn't like you." "All true," Senna said, "except some nights Sable's stew is excellent." She took the reins before the woman's hands failed her and led the team toward the livery. "You can sleep indoors." "Can I?" The woman's mouth creased. "I can almost remember what that is." She glanced at the bell. "And there's a bell that rings itself." "It rings when it wants truth," Senna said, and heard herself believe it. She did the small work a town does for a stranger on a wagon. Water, blankets, the loan of a cradle that had waited for a baby to borrow it. She listened to the boy's careful description of a calf with a white ear and a temper. She loosened a girth. She earned Sable's nod and Mrs. Ortega's gentlest raise of an eyebrow. When she finally stood alone again in the slanting blue light, the moon was a bite above the far ridge, and the willow at the east bend made a darker shape against the river's softer shine. She took the lantern. She did not look for Rowan. Some roads you learn by walking them without anyone ready to catch you. The willow had a way of holding moonlight in its leaves, like silver caught in a net. Senna stepped into the hush beneath it and lowered the lantern to the ground as Sable had told her, not as a signal, but as a line she would not cross unless the truth crossed first. The man waited in the shadow. He stepped forward when he could stand it no longer. He was young in the way men get to be young when they've done enough harm to think they've earned age. His hat was poor but clean. His coat was good but scared. He smelled like flour sacks and fear. "Jay?" Senna said. He nodded. "Joss," he said. "Joss Vale. Kitty's kin." It wasn't a question. "My sister," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word like a board with a knot in it. "She's been sick with the not saying. She gave me the glove and said if I was going to be a man, I could start by not being a coward. I've been both, and I'd like to try a third thing." "Tell it," Senna said. The lantern made a circle on the ground between them. Inside it, she would step. Outside it, he could stay. Joss twisted his hat between his hands until the brim might never be round again.
He said, Calder came to the mill late. He said the ledgers wanted quiet. He said the river wanted to help him, and he'd give it a reason. He swallowed. He had oil, more than we keep by the saws. He said the sluice would run backwards if the jam held and the water rose. He said if the right people were trapped under, the right people would be blamed. He says a lot. I listened because he had money and I had a mouth to feed. That wasn't mine. The men under, Senna said. They died? Joss nodded, head down. I didn't know he was going to jam the grate. I thought he just wanted to make a point. The words were sour. I didn't stop him. I should have. I tried to go back when the smoke took the lower floor, but the river came hard and the door went with it, and He looked up, eyes bright with shame. I ran. Kitty found me in the morning and put the glove in my hand and said if I didn't take it to the sheriff, she'd take it to my grave when Calder finished what he started. Senna drew a slow breath. Why me? She asked. Why the church bell? Because you stopped running and the bell rang. I figured God was either trying to tell you something or me. I've made it a habit to ignore both. I thought I'd break the habit once. Senna stepped into the circle of the lantern's light. You'll tell the sheriff, she said. Joss put both hands up, like a man calming a horse. I'll tell her, but not from the jail. Not while Calder has coin and men and a train ticket in his pocket for the minute he smells iron and law. I'll tell her when she can take his watch and his hands and put them where they can't reach Kitty. I'll tell her if you stand there when I do.
You're asking for courage you already have, Senna said, but I'll stand. He closed his eyes like a prayer caught him by surprise. Tonight, he meets a man by the rail spur, Joss said, voice shaking, to trade for a paper that says the fire was an accident, signed by a man who hasn't seen the mills since last summer. After Moon said, I can take you where a body can hear them talk without a body being seen. A branch shifted, not willow, not wind. Roan stepped out of the cottonwoods on the high bank like he had been carved from them. He carried quiet the way some men carry guns. His hat brim was low, his eyes were higher. Roan, Senna said, and some of the air in her chest became air she could own again. Didn't want to spook your truth, he said, as apology and approval at once. He looked at Joss. You done ran long enough, he said gently. Let's use your legs for standing. They moved together along the river path where the willows bowed and the banks whispered. Joss knew where to put his feet. Roan knew where to put his silence. Senna knew how to breathe when what you're about to hear will change what you've promised yourself. The rail spur lay like a sentence that hadn't decided how to end. A coal car slept, half on the siding and half on the idea of it. The depot office held light, spare as bone. They crouched behind a stack of ties that smelled of creosote and rain. Calder arrived first, alone except for the way a man like him is never alone. His confidence came 3 strides ahead to warn the night who it was about to host. He paced. He checked his watch. He smiled at himself, because nobody else wanted to. A second figure came from the far side of the yard, a man with a coat that had been brave once and was pretending it still was. He had the kind of face that looks honest from far away and like it remembers a better face when you get close. He carried a satchel. Mr. Rook, he said, tipping his hat. Bad business. Bad business produces excellent paperwork. You have it? The man opened the satchel and drew out a folded document with a seal that had sealed other things better. Affidavit, signed by Whit Hale, millwright, stating that he inspected the sluice on the date in question and found no evidence of tampering. Witnessed by me, a notary of Sage Bluff. He coughed, hypothetically. Hypothetically, Calder purred. He reached for the paper. The knight decided to interrupt. Miss Ortega's voice came from the shadow by the office door. "I wouldn't take that if I were you, Mr. Rook." Calder didn't startle with his body. He startled with his watch. It jumped in his hand. He slid it into his pocket and turned slowly, smiling. "Sheriff, you work late." "I sleep better when the town breathes honest." Miss Ortega stepped into the light with two deputies who had learned to put their feet down without announcing it. Sable stood behind them as if she were a deputy of Kitchens. The livery cat inexplicably sat on the office counter like an old woman's opinion. Senna felt Roan's breath at her ear. "She asked me to fetch you if you were going to be brave. I took the long way," he murmured. The notary lifted both hands, palms innocent. "I am merely a courier of possibilities, of crimes," Miss Ortega said, not unkindly. "Step away from Mr. Rook." Calder's smile showed the white tips of all his carefully brushed teeth. "Sheriff, I admire your energy, but without a witness, without any evidence but a damp glove and a town's appetite for morality, you are a sermon without a congregation." "Witness," Miss Ortega said softly, and the word moved past Senna like a canoe. Joss stepped into it, or it would have left without him. He straightened. He walked into the light like a man learning to carry his own name. "I saw you," he told Calder. "I saw the oil. I saw you jam the sluice. I heard you say the river would do the rest." His voice wobbled, and then learned the bell's lesson and stopped wobbling. "And I ran. I won't run now." Calder's temper showed, fast and cold. "You think words undo what's already done?" He flicked his gaze at the deputies. "I'll be out by morning. A fine, a handshake, a contribution to your badge's shine." "Maybe, maybe not. Depends on how long the train waits for you while I take my time walking the judge through your watch and your friends, and the way Whit Hale never signed a thing he didn't first misspell, and his name here is clean as gospel. Depends on how many men remember where you stood and what your hat looked like in smoke." Calder's hand went inside his coat. Not fast, not slow. The kind of motion men trust when they think other men are slower. Roan's hand moved faster, not to a gun, to Senna's shoulder. Pressing it down, Joss froze. The deputy's pistols came up, clean as morning. "Don't," Miss Ortega said. The word had iron in it. "You got 9 lives, Mr. Rook? You'll need 11. Calder's hand came out with the watch, as if he'd meant that all along. "You're not the only one who can measure time." He snapped the case open. The coal car shifted, metal answering metal with a kiss. Somewhere a fox yipped, because it didn't know it was in a story.
She stepped down from the church, 1 stair, 2, and by the 3rd, their breath met between them and made a new weather. He went ahead of her by a pace, not because she needed leading, but because men like him understand that you walk a woman into a new house by letting her be first at the threshold. The ranch lay 3 miles out, where the cottonwoods give up to grass, and the grass gives up to sky. The house was square and honest. The porch had a board with a loose nail that clicked when you stepped just there. He didn't step there. The yard had a pump that stuck a little at the top of the pull, and then forgave you on the way down. The barn smelled of hay and old apple and good work. He showed her the stove that smoked when the wind was wrong, and the window that stuck when the weather remembered last winter. He showed her the peg where a second coat would be welcome, and the shelf where a second cup would not go missing for lack of a hook. He showed her the mare that hated thunder, and the old dog that liked everyone, but took a while to admit it. He didn't show her the bed. He pointed toward the small room where it was, and said, "It's clean," and left the door half-closed, which is a way of telling a truth in furniture. "Why'd you stop at the church step?" he asked, when the kettle boiled and the roof settled into its night noises, and courage didn't have to be performed, only lived. "Because it didn't look at me," she said. "And because it did."
She let him hear the shape of that paradox, and then she laughed, because laughing with him didn't cost her the breath she'd need for the morning, because I wanted the first door I opened to be mine. Was it? It is now. He poured coffee like it was a ceremony worth doing right. He didn't ask the questions a man asks when he wants to own the answers. He asked the kind he asks when he wants to share them. You got anyone who will come looking? They'll look until they find a woman who is me-shaped but quieter. Then they'll get tired. I don't get tired of the right things, he said. She let that sit. She let the house learn her breathing. She let the dog sniff her hand and decide to hate her less. She stood on the porch and watched the river throw moonlight back at the stars. She decided the distance between the church step and this porch was a measurement she could live with. The next week was a week of mending. Men who had cussed at Calder Rook under their breath learned to cuss him where the sheriff could hear it. Work returned to the mill by slow inches and careful hands. Sable's stew learned a new spice because Senna had suggested it, like a question. Kitty's cough got better, Joss's hands shook less, and Senna learned the fences. Roan rode with her. He didn't narrate the land the way a man does when he thinks a woman can't see. He pointed at a draw where snow liked to linger and let her find the logic of it. He showed her a gate that had learned to lift before it swung and stood back while she learned its mood. He spoke to his horse in a voice that made the hair on Senna's arms rise, because a man's kindness with an animal is the kind that leaves paw prints on a woman's decision. They were content, which is a sentence you can almost never say out loud for fear the world will hear you and come to see about it. The world came to see about it. It started with a letter that wasn't a letter, a scrap of newsprint tucked under the chapel door with a stone and a word in someone's pencil. Sorry. Mrs. Ortega took it in her palm and felt the sorry and said, "We'll find out what for." It continued with a train whistle that didn't sound like it meant to stop at Hollow Bend. It blew long and then again, which means speed, which means urgency, which means trouble coming on rails. It turned into Roan not returning at dusk when he said he'd be back by the color of the sky he'd named for her benefit 3 nights ago. Senna kept the light in the window the way Sable had taught her, not as beacon, by a boundary. The dog paced. The mare stared at the road with the kind of stare that makes a person put her boots on. She took the lantern and didn't tell herself she wouldn't need it. She walked the track between the house and the eastern fence line, where the cottonwoods leaned into the wind like men leaning into a joke they weren't sure was appropriate. She met the world halfway and told it could come the other half if it meant to be decent. It wasn't. The eastern fence line held something that wasn't supposed to be there. A coat. Roan's. Folded on a fence post like a man had decided to come back for it a minute later and had not come back. The dog whined. The mare stamped. The lantern's light showed scuffed dirt where boots had said sentences. She knelt and put her fingers to the ground where the story had pressed itself. She knew 2 sets of prints, Roan's and someone's who learned to walk like he was being watched. She knew a third, lighter, dancing on its toes like a boy who didn't yet know fear had a will. She followed the prints to the river. Men who don't know rivers think they only flow. Senna knew they keep. On the bank, the mud told her a thing she didn't want to hear. There had been a boat. It had pushed off where the willow made a curtain. It had gone where the current would carry you if you didn't know how to row and you didn't care. She stood up, and the night stood up with her. Behind her, the church bell began to ring. It rang wrong. Not the steady count that tells a town how to behave, but a frantic clatter that says someone is at the rope who doesn't know how to ask and knows they can't afford not to. Senna ran. Running gives a story a shape. Sometimes the shape is necessary. She crested the rise above Hollow Bend and saw the street lit like a thought that burns. Lamps swung, shadows ran, Mrs. Ortega's badge caught flame.
The livery spit sparks because someone had knocked a lantern and the straw had opinions about that. Sable stood on her porch with a bucket in each hand and a sound in her throat that meant rage and prayer at once. On the chapel step, a boy hammered the bell rope so hard skin had come off both his palms. He couldn't stop even to wince. Blood slicked the rope where his hand slid. He looked like a child who'd ridden a long way and forgot to bring the part of himself that cries. "Tommy Whitlow," Mrs. Ortega barked, arriving from everywhere at once. "What are you doing ringing my town awake?" The boy's eyes found Senna. They stuck. He breathed like a bird. "They took him," he gasped, "by the willow. Men with a smell like city coats. They said to trade him for a train that doesn't stop." He gulped. "Said to bring the woman from the church step if we wanted him back with all his blood." Senna's knees went polite and then remembered they were allowed to lock. Roan's coat had been folded on a post like a promise. Now the promise had a price. "Who?" Mrs. Ortega demanded. "Names." Tommy shook his head like a dog shakes water. "Didn't have any. Had hats." Sable swore an age-old oath in a language nobody still spoke and reached for Senna with the kind of grip you use to keep a person from falling off a cliff. "You don't trade yourself to men who write ransom notes with river mud," she said. "I won't trade myself," Senna said, and felt the bell ring in her bones until her voice matched it. "I'll trade what they want and won't expect. A town that knows how to hold a line." Mrs. Ortega's eyes were already mapping. "They think we'll come like coins. We'll go like a ledger. Quiet, thorough, with witnesses." She tossed Tommy a cloth. "Wrap your hands. You're my witness." She looked at Senna. "You're my boundary." "What do they want from me?" Senna asked. "Leverage," Sable said. "The only kind men like that know how to spell." The boy swallowed. "Said, the woman from the church step. Said she could pay." His gaze found Senna's face again and stuck there the way boys' gazes do when they have learned what it looks like when a person decides to be more than she thought she could be. "Said to bring her alone." "Then we'll bring her not alone," Mrs. Ortega said. "We'll bring her with a town." Senna set her lantern down on the chapel step. The bell rope swung behind her shoulder, still bleeding the boy's blood. The church door leaned into her palm. The night sucked in a breath and held it. "Tell me where," she said. Tommy pointed with a hand that trembled. "East Bend, where the willow gets to be a curtain." Senna looked at Sable, then at Mrs. Ortega, then at the window of the boarding house where the square of light had become a square of resolve. She thought of Roan's stove that smoked when the wind was wrong, and of his mare that hated thunder, and of the peg that had been ready for a second coat. She thought of the word he'd tried to finish before Calder had interrupted it. She thought of the river and its opinions. She stepped down one riser, then the next. She felt the town step with her, not in front, not behind, beside. "Let's go," she said. The boy tried to hand her the bell rope as if it were a talisman. She put his hand back on his own chest and felt his heart under the scrapes. "Keep this ringing if the town needs to breathe. Tonight, it breathes with its feet." Mrs. Ortega moved, and the town moved, like a hand that had decided to pick something up. Men who were slow to anger discovered they could walk fast if someone they owed a favor had been taken. Women who had carried water discovered they could carry rope and sense and the names of the men who had taught them fear. The livery cat somehow led. They went to the river with the calm of a storm that knows its path. The willow lifted and let them under. The boat waited like a sentence with a period on both ends. On the far bank, the train whistled again. It had not decided whether to stop for a story or to run one down. A figure stepped out of the shadow line. Tall, coat like a city, hat like a threat. Voice like a smile with iron filings. Evening, Hollowbend, Calder Rook said. He was out. He was free. He was where the river held secrets and the rail made promises. He had Roan's bandana in his hand. "Bring me the woman from the church step," he called over the water, and the willow shivered with the sound. "Bring me Senna Bly, or I'll teach this town what leverage is." Senna felt Sable's hand on her sleeve and Mrs. Ortega's plan forming next to her like a map drawing itself. She stepped into the moon and let Calder see her face. "Take me," she said, and her voice did a thing the bell had been trying to teach it. The river leaned in to listen. Calder's smile sharpened. "Come alone," he said. Senna took one step toward the bank. Behind her, from the darkness, the mare screamed, and something rose out of the river's black that did not belong to water at all. It held a man's shape. It held a gun. It held Roan's hat. Senna's mouth opened. The train's whistle split the night, and then from the bank beyond Calder, a second voice stepped into the story and said clear as the bell had rung, "Don't move."
The words came from the cottonwood's shadow on the far bank, steady as a plumb line. A lantern blinked once, low, and the willow leaves turned the light to coins. Calder Rook's smile went thin enough to cut. He didn't turn his head. Men like him learned to let arrogance do their looking. Roan was the shape in the river, soaked to the ribs, hat plastered to his brow, eyes level as a horizon. He came up slow beside the skiff that bobbed against the snag, half water, half man, all resolve. Senna felt something in her chest let go of a held note. What came after wasn't relief, it was readiness. Mrs. Ortega stepped into the moonlight behind Calder, badge catching silver. "Hands where I can read them," she said. Two deputies ghosted out with her, boots finding quiet as if it had been laid down for them. Sable stood to Senna's right, rope coiled, jaw set in the language of women who have done kitchens and funerals and now preferred neither. Calder's fingers flexed around Roan's bandana. He held it up like an invitation to violence. "Sheriff," he purred, "it appears I command both banks tonight." "Seems instead you've got a talent for standing where the ground gives," Mrs. Ortega answered. "Step back from the skiff." The train on the spur breathed, metal settling on metal, impatient. Somewhere a coupler coughed. Calder glanced toward it, flicker small as guilt, and Senna counted the glance the way you count a man's bullets when you can't count his heart. Roan lifted the pistol he'd salvaged from the skiff, Calder's by the look of the silverwork, and thumbed the hammer until it clicked polite. "Let him keep talking," he murmured toward the waterline, voice pitched to carry to Senna and no farther. "Words make their own mud." Calder obliged. "Bring me the woman from the church step," he called again, showman to the end, "and I will trade you your quiet cowboy." His teeth flashed. "I am magnanimous." "Magnanimous men don't set mills on fire," Sable said, as if correcting a recipe. She didn't raise her voice, but the word carried like steam. Calder laughed soft. "You town people love your stories. Bells that ring themselves, women's names like charms. But the only story that matters is the train. It leaves in 7 minutes. I'll be on it. You won't stop me with stew and sermons." "Funny thing about trains," Roan said, sliding his free hand along the skiff's gunwale until he felt the knot that would make the rope come loose when a man thought he had it. He loosened a half-hitch, one whisper at a time. "Senna," Mrs. Ortega said, without looking away from Calder, "I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. Stand exactly where you are and say only what you mean." "I can do that," Senna said. Her voice rang once, the chapel bell's cousin. Calder's smile widened as if she'd agreed to something else. "Come, Miss Bly," he called, spreading his arms. "The world is large. Your step is small.
trade it for iron and forward motion. Senna took one step, but sideways, to stand in the exact middle of the needle the town had threaded. "I'll trade nothing," she said. "I'll name things. You don't want me. You want proof your money can still buy fear." She looked at Roan, then back at Calder. "It can't." The willow hissed as the night wind changed. The skiff kissed the snag. Mrs. Ortega's deputies eased forward one pace, then held. A shape moved behind Calder, small, quick. Joss Vale, hat low, courage higher, rose from the bank grass with a length of willow pole like a shepherd's staff. He didn't swing it. He set the crook behind Calder's knees with the gentleness of a man hooking a lamb out of a bramble, and Calder sat down hard in the cold mud with a curse that tried to be graceful and wasn't. Roan used the moment. He put his shoulder to the skiff and shoved. The boat slid, pivoted, and showed Mrs. Ortega's side the gunwale instead of Calder's. Water took the hole where water had wanted to take it all along, toward the near bank, into hands. "Hands," Mrs. Ortega repeated. Calder's men, the ones who'd learned to walk like they were being watched, came ragged out of the cottonwood shade. Two at first, then a third. One had Roan's coat slung over his shoulder like a trophy he hadn't paid the price of. The mare screamed again from the road beyond, the sound a horse makes when it can smell a man who thinks he's owner and isn't. Sable flicked her rope once, twice, like a woman airing a sheet. It sang. "Boys," she said, conversational, "you point iron at my sheriff in my town, and I'll teach you what a dishcloth and a length of hemp can do." They hesitated, long enough. Mrs. Ortega took Calder by the lapels as if tidying him for a photograph and spun him to face her with wrists already wholesome with iron. He tried to make his smile mean indifference. It meant teeth. "You don't have the law, you have theater," he said.
"I have both," Mrs. Ortega answered, "and I have witnesses, and I have time. You said you had a train. I have the track." She nodded to the deputies, and they moved him like a table you care about. Careful, inevitable. The skiff nosed gravel. Rowan climbed out wet and quiet, pistol low. His boots answered the riverbank with gratitude. He looked at Senna first. He always had, she realized, looked first to the thing that told him his compass still pointed somewhere clean. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, then found she needed to speak to prove her breath belonged to her. "You look like you lost a fight with a creek," she said. He grinned, a flash of boy under the miles. "River," he corrected. "Creeks forgive." "Not all of them," Sable said. Mrs. Ortega's eyes were on the track. The train exhaled again, longer. "We're not done," she said. "He's got friends and paper. Paper has a way of making people foolish." She raised her chin towards Senna. "You ready to tell the judge what you told the river?" "Yes," Senna looked at Joss. "And he is too." Joss swallowed and nodded. "I'm tired of the quiet," he said. "It's loud." They walked back to town with the steadying rhythm of a group that chose its pace together. The livery glowed tame now. Men had made a straight line of buckets, and for once the fire had listened. The boy who'd rung the bell slept on the chapel step with his hands bandaged and the rope coiled neat as a halo at his shoulder. At the jail, the judge had come down in his robe with his hair wild like a man late to his own morality. He listened to Mrs. Ortega with his mouth set, and to Joss with his hand over his mouth, and to Senna with his hand down, open. Calder spoke too, of course he did, oiling the room until it slid sideways. But the glove sat on the desk like a saint's relic, and Kitty Vale walked in with her braid like a banner and said, quiet as a winter river, "He wore it." And that was the end of one kind of story and the beginning of another. It did not end in a night. Town justice never does, if it is real. Calder's money tried to prove itself a better witness than a woman. It ran up against Sable's ledger, which had no price for dignity. It ran up against Mrs. Ortega's maps, which showed how a man moves when he thinks nobody sees. It ran up against Joss, who shook but kept standing, Kitty, who coughed but spoke, Rowan, who said little and meant all of it, and Senna, who found out that your voice can live an entire life in a week and be more yourself at the end than at the start. The railroad sent a man in a suit with a watch that did not brag. He said words like liability and affidavit, and then looked at the river as if it were older than paperwork. "We'll rebuild the trestle right," he said, "and the mill if you decide it's a thing worth having without the rot." "It is," Sable said, "if the hands that cut are the hands that count." So the town did a thing that towns forget they can do. It made the mill a cooperative. Joss did the sums, Kitty double-checked them. Men who had never signed their names except at a store counter signed them to each other. Mrs. Ortega stood by with the badge and the patience of a woman who knows how long it takes for a habit to change. The judge read the paper slow and nodded like he'd tasted something honest. In the small spaces between all that, Senna learned the house by heart. She learned the squeak of the third porch board and how to pull the pump handle without making it complain, and the exact weight of the skillet that liked to pretend it was heavier than it was. She learned Rowan's laugh. She learned the mare's way of forgiving thunder if you spoke her name as if it were an apology. She learned where the dog slept when he was pretending he didn't like to, which was under the table exactly where Rowan's boot would find him at supper time. She learned the valley's light. It came in particular, thin and blue over the east fence at first, thick as honey on the kitchen table by 11, a shard through the barn boards that would land in the same rectangle every day as if God had set a knife there. She learned how it made Rowan's shoulders a geography she could read, and how it made her own hands look like instruments and not injuries. She did not move into the house all at once. She moved into the porch, then the kitchen, then the chair by the hearth that had been empty for long enough that it had memorized some other body and was ready to be taught another. The bedroom door stayed half closed. It said what it needed to say without words. We will choose this together, and we will not choose it for the wrong reason. On Sundays, the bell learned to ring in a way that meant more than one thing at once: worship, warning, welcome. The first Sunday after the river and the willow and the skiff, the chapel overflowed. Mrs. Ortega sat in the front like a pew could be a station. Sable sang like a woman who has been telling truth in smaller rooms and was glad for a big one. The boy with the bandaged hands sat next to the rope and did not touch it, which is its own kind of strength. The Reverend, back from Up Valley, glanced at Senna as if meeting a parishioner he had heard about in ink and rumor. Passages talk about strangers, but they don't say the stranger will be the one to teach you your own name. He looked at Sable, or your own book. He looked at Mrs. Ortega, or your own law. He looked at Senna last, or your own bell.
After, on the step that had been a bed and then a boundary and now a belonging, a traveler stopped to read the town on people's faces. He had a way of holding himself that suggested he knew where his exits were and didn't intend to use them. He tipped his hat. "Heard you had a fire," he said. "Heard you had a flood. Heard you had a woman." "We had a town," Sable said, and the man nodded as if that was the report he had been sent for. There was a day a week later when it seemed finished. The judge sent papers downstream with seals that made a fine thud when they landed on a desk. Calder Rook went north in a wagon, without a hat and without a watch, and without anyone interested in keeping company with the kind of sunburn a man gets when his smile is gone. The river resumed its ordinary miracles. The cooperative ran a line of new planks, and they were straight. Then the storm came. It rose fast from the west, with a wall of color that might have been a bruise if the sky had skin. Wind hit the cottonwoods, and they bowed like men who had found a truth they couldn't argue with. The first drops were fat enough to strike like thrown coins. The second were needles. The third were a sheet. Roan looked at the slope above the east pasture and saw it all at once, the way it would give, the way the water would choose a channel, the way that channel wasn't the creek but the road, the way the road fed the hollow where the house sat kind as a cup. Up, he said to Senna, already moving. Up the ridge, I'll turn the flow. You'll drown, she said. Creeks forgive, he answered, and kissed the air near her temple because there wasn't time to find skin. He ran. She ran after him because lives are made of decisions you don't write down. The dog barked like a cussed-out saint. The mare blew lake water out of her nose, though she was dry. The wind made the house talk in tongues. On the rise above the pasture, they set their bodies against the earth, Roan with the shovel, Senna with her hands, cutting a trough where the water wanted a gorge. Rain blinded, mud grabbed. The first rush shouldered past the new channel and laughed. The second hesitated and fell for the trick. The third came roaring and found the path the people had chosen for it. "Give it a name!" Roan shouted over the water. "Mercy!" Senna shouted back and felt the cut deepen under her palms. They held that line until the sky remembered it had other business. When the rain broke, it did it like a promise is kept, all at once, then as if it had always been kept. The house below still stood. The pump still leaned toward morning. The stove would smoke later, as if nothing had happened. On the porch steps they sat and let their breathing learn them again. Mud had drawn maps up Senna's arms. Roan's hair lay in patterns God hadn't meant but admired anyway. The dog came and dropped its chin on Senna's knee, which is a dog's way of counting to one. The mare in the yard nodded like a magistrate. "You're not alone anymore," Roan said after a long time, not as reassurance, but as a statement of geography. "I know," she said, "but I also am." She turned her palm up. He looked at it like a new country. "Both can be true." "They don't cancel," he agreed. He put his hand in hers and didn't squeeze. "They multiply." Days grew from that day like branches. Senna learned where the grass stayed green when the rest went to straw, at how much salt Sable wiped in the stew when she was telling the story of the river for the 5th time to men who had been at the river and wanted to hear it as if they hadn't. She learned the names of cows that wouldn't keep their feet under them and how to lean into a wind without letting it borrow anything you need back. At the mill, the first run after the rebuild was not perfect. It wobbled, which is how the living do after they've died a little and come back. Men corrected it with gentleness, which is also how the living do. Women brought bread because bread is proof that flour forgives fire. Joss wrote the first check to a hand that had never held a check with their own name in the payee line, and his pen didn't stutter. Kitty counted the tills and coughed only once. The bell rang on purpose now, sometimes for joy, sometimes for help. Once for a wedding. Not Senna's, the town's appetite for patience needed fattening up. When the Reverend said, "Who gives this woman?" at young May Ortega's marriage, May answered herself, and Mrs. Ortega's badge shone like a second ring. And then came the morning, the word changed shape. It was nothing at first. The way Senna's stomach kept a rhythm her breath didn't choose. The way her hands went softer around cups she used to hold by their edges. The way the sight of a cradle in Sable's parlor made her throat work. She told no one. She told the river. The river said nothing back, which she took for consent.
At dusk, she told Rowan, on the step of the house that had been brave through floods and small cuts and a dog that snored. He didn't say the wrong thing, which is something men do when they've learned everything else and not that. He set his hand over hers, exactly where her name used to be the only thing she could feel, and said, "We'll teach the bell another meaning." The town knew before the town was told, because towns do. Sable took out a blanket somebody's grandmother had knitted when yarn was cheap and time wasn't, and smoothed it with a ceremony that could make the unreasonable reasonable. Mrs. Ortega did not cry. Her eyes simply shone the way metal does when you care for it. The dog learned to sleep closer to the bed and stopped pretending he didn't. When the baby came,
The river was low and slow, as if it had decided to listen and not speak. The sky was a straightforward blue without threats in it. Sable told stories between coaching. Mrs. Ortega counted without counting. Rowan learned how to stand useless and be useful anyway. Senna went to a place beyond words and brought a person back. They named her Lark because she woke with the dawn and made music without instruction. The first time the bell rang after, it was the boy with the healed hands who pulled the rope, and the sound rolled across Hollow Bend like the kind of news that doesn't require anyone's permission. The house remade itself around a new center. The stove smoked when the wind was wrong and then didn't when Senna opened the flue, and the flue felt like a metaphor. The mare learned to accept a new level of noise. The dog learned to be patient with being climbed like furniture. Rowan learned that he could fix a fence with a baby in a sling and look more complete than foolish. Senna learned to sleep in chapters. She learned to hear the difference between a cry that says "I am" and a cry that says "I need." She learned to tell herself a story she could live with, all the nights the old step called her back in her mind and asked whether she missed the way a porch feels when it's made of borrowed wood. "Sometimes," she told the step in her mind, "but the door opens here too." The town changed because that's what towns do when they decide to deserve their river. The cooperative paid out through drought because they saved during snow. The judge cut his hair. The reverend learned to shorten his sermons when the stew was particularly good. Travelers stopped and stayed, and the ones who stayed learned that you don't get to turn a church step into a stage unless the woman who used to sleep there invites you and you promise to sweep after. And Calder? There are always men who think a story ends when they leave it. He thought so. The paper said other things. He tried other towns, other watches, other ways to be the loudest person in a room. None of them took. Once a letter came to Mrs. Ortega with handwriting that had learned humility late and only partially. It said he'd married, then he hadn't. It said he'd found God, then he hadn't. It said he'd found a river where the willow's leaves looked like silver coins and he'd tried to pluck one and it had cut him. The sheriff filed the letter where it wouldn't bother anyone. Years stacked themselves in the corner like chairs after a dance. Lark learned to toddle and then fall in deliberate ways that told you she trusted the ground to be there. Senna's hair collected sun where it used to collect hunger. Rowan's laugh deepened. His silences did too, but they were the good kind, the kind with windows. One afternoon near first haying, a wagon pulled up to the church and a couple stepped down with the nervous cheerfulness of people asking a town for room. The woman's hands were inked with ledger smudges. The man's were scarred where Wood had argued with him and won. They asked for work, for a bed, for the kind of patience you can't pay for in cash. Sable pointed her spoon at a broom. Mrs. Ortega pointed her badge at a list. Senna pointed her palm at the porch and said, "Sit, then tell me who taught you your name." "We did," the woman said, and smiled like a ledger balancing. That night on the ranch, after Lark's breathing had fallen into the careless measure of a child who has always known a roof, Senna stood with Rowan on the porch and watched the river reflect a sky untroubled by men's designs. The cottonwoods murmured. The bell in the distance answered once for nothing at all. "You know," Rowan said, as if remarking on weather, "I never asked the question the way I first meant to." "What question?" Senna said. "The one I was trying to finish when the bell and Calder and the train tried to steal it." He took his hat off and held it by the crown like a man who doesn't need it to be brave. "Let's..." He stopped and smiled at himself. "Let's make home a thing we do on purpose." "We've been doing that," she said.
We have, he agreed. But I'd like to ask it like a ritual, not because the law requires it, because I do. The porch board that always clicked didn't just then. The world held its breath and pretended not to. Senna turned, leaned her shoulder into his chest, felt the steady there. "Ask," she said. "Stay," he said simply. "Stay even when the river changes its mind.
Stay when the stove misbehaves and the neighbors bring their worry and Lark learns to climb and forgets to come down. Stay when I'm foolish and when I figure it out too late. Stay when the bell rings and it's for someone else's sorrow. His voice dipped. And when it rings for ours. Stay and call it home. She laughed, quick and bright. I've been staying, she said. But yes, again. Yes. They didn't kiss then either, not because it would have been wrong, but because the word had its own shape and they respected it. Later, there would be kissing that belonged to the everyday, which is the best kind. For now, there was air that tasted like iron and rain, and trees that knew they were trees, and a river that knew it was believed. In the months that followed, the town added layers to the story. A sign went up at the chapel, Sanctuary Open. Beneath it, in Sable's knee hand, and Sweep After. The cooperative bought a second saw with profits that felt like clean bread. The boy with the healed hands made a habit of teaching other boys how to ring a bell without bleeding. Mrs. Ortega trained a girl with a braid like new rope to take her badge someday. The dog finally admitted he loved Lark and slept in the middle of the floor like a rug with a heartbeat. Senna never forgot the step. Sometimes, when the moon made a path across the yard like a dare, she walked into town alone, late, to sit there a while and listen to the wood remember her. It told her what it had given her. It told her what she had given it. They argued kindly over which truth was larger. On one such night, as Summer considered how to leave without being rude, a traveler passed through with a fiddle case and a smile like someone who'd lost something and found something else better. He paused at the chapel, tipped his hat to the sign and to Senna and to the bell, order deliberate. "You the woman from the story?" he asked. "I'm from this one," she said. "And the cowboy?" "He's from it too." "Good," the man said, satisfied, and moved on. At home, Roan had left the porch light like a boundary, not a beacon. Lark slept with one arm thrown over her head recklessly, as if claiming sky. The mare dozed with one ear on the weather. The stove waited for morning to choose whether to behave. Senna stood in the doorway and let the quiet become hers. She touched the lintel because touching wood had become her way of saying grace. She stepped inside. The bell rang far off, once, twice, as if to count the distance between then and now and bless it. And that was the truth she kept, that once she had been a woman who slept on a church step for 3 nights, trembling at the sound of her own breath, that once a voice had come out of dusk and said, "Let's go home." And she had discovered that an invitation could be a map, that home was not a place you were given, it was a place you made, swept and oiled and defended and laughed inside, that the river would sometimes try to take it and you would sometimes let the river teach you how to hold it better, that a bell could be a throat for a town, that a name, said right, could become a door you both walked through. So when the next stranger sat on the step and pretended she wasn't asking for help, Senna sat beside her and placed a broom between them, like a bridge. "It's yours a while. The step, the bell if you need it. But the door opens, too." The woman looked at the broom, then at the door. "I don't want to owe anyone. You'll pay in work. It's the only currency here that means what it should." She smiled a little, thinking of Sable. "And in telling the truth when it costs you." The woman's shoulders dropped the distance between a step and the bed. The river went on saying what it said. The cottonwoods kept their counsel. The town breathed. Said I went home. Roan met her at the gate, hand finding her hand in the kind of habit you don't break unless something better asks you to, and nothing better had. Lark ran from the porch, legs wild, and slammed into her knees like an answer. "Everything all right?" Roan asked, though he already knew by the way her eyes had settled where the sky did. "It is," she said. "Tomorrow we'll ask again. We'll answer then." They went inside and shut the door on the night gently, as if it were a guest you'd welcome back. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.